Recruiting. Auburn is one of the best in the conference at recruiting, but who's truly better and how many are behind Auburn at this point? Welcome on into the Auburn Express, powered by the War Report. I'm your host, Mike G, and thank you so much for making us your first listen of every single day. It's Monday, and joining me as he does every single Monday is my good friend, Caesar Walker, a.k.a. C-Dub. Talk a little Auburn football. Caesar, on today's show, we're going to talk a little bit about that talent gap between Auburn and the top of the league. But we haven't talked much about the talent gap between Auburn and kind of the middle of the league, which is what we want to talk about today. So we'll figure out where Auburn ranks and then talk about what schools are truly competing with Auburn this coming season in terms of talent. Let's jump right in here. I think we can all agree Georgia and Texas are on another level when it comes to talent. Those guys are recruiting at such a high level, but Hugh Freeze said, hey, to catch them, I need a few recruiting classes in the top 7. Now, when I did my one-on-one with him, he mentioned, look, Mike, there's not a lot of difference between the number 1 and the number 5 class or the number 5 and the number 8 class. Usually it's just one recruit, but the name of the game is how well did you fill your needs? Auburn has been doing a great job of filling needs as of late, but if they have their quarterback, who is on that tier with Auburn? Because, like I said, before we start recording, we agreed Alabama, Texas, Georgia, probably in that top tier of school in the SEC as far as talent is concerned. I think Alabama probably on the lower end at this point, below Georgia and Texas. But in that next tier, I feel like are schools like Auburn and LSU and Ole Miss and Missouri. You know, how do you see Auburn versus the schools in those middle tiers?
I think Auburn kind of put itself behind the 8 ball starting in like 2020, right? With the firing of Gus Malzahn and bringing in of Brian Harsin, we begin to see recruiting slip. And the fact that we weren't able to meet our needs along the offensive line, particularly offensive tackle, it really began to sit Auburn back a bit, especially when it comes to the offensive side of the ball. But when I look at programs like a Texas A&M, you know, Texas A&M had a big-time recruiting class a few years ago under Jimbo Fisher, and he has always recruited well wherever he's been. Now, he didn't do much with the talent. Obviously, he ended up being, sent to the door. But you have programs like Texas A&M, that next tier of programs like LSU. You do have programs like a Florida, an Ole Miss. Obviously, Lane Kiffin has a bit of a different philosophy for how he goes about filling needs. He's big on the transfer portal. Florida is in a similar situation like Auburn. They're fighting to get back to relevancy, but they're in a similar boat. They've recruited well over the last few years with Billy Napier as a head coach. But I think that Auburn with Hugh Freeze in just a short few years, he has done enough to, in my opinion, put Auburn in that next tier of programs, the Ole Misses, the A&Ms, the LSUs. And I think that he's aiming for the top tier. And he still has maybe a few recruiting classes left to go. But I like where Auburn sits right now, considering where they was just 2-3 years ago, Mike, when Hugh Freeze was hired.
Yeah, look, we took a look at those recruiting classes there again in 2025. When you look at Auburn and LSU, which I think at this point we both agree those two schools are kind of in that same tier of current talent. Auburn, according to 247, 26 commits in 2025, came in at 8th. LSU, 23 commits. They came in ranked at 10. You know, the SEC obviously dominated the top 10 in recruiting in 2025. LSU at 10, A&M at 9, Auburn at 8, Florida at 7, Alabama at 3, Georgia at 2, and Texas at 1. Caesar, that's 7 of the top 10 in the conference. In the top 10 of recruiting overall in the NCAA. That's an insane amount of talent. You know, if you're Auburn, it's such a weird conversation to have about being like 8th in the country, but only 5th in the conference in recruiting. Like, wow. So lots of talent to go around the SEC. But if you're Auburn, you got to continue to get better results out of the talent than those teams in that tier with you. So right now in that tier, for 2025, because 2026 is still coming together, so I'm going to exclude that from the conversation because we don't really know what those classes are coming together like. Right now, Auburn only has 7 commits. So wherever you see their ranking at, it's not where they're going to be in 2 months.
Right.
But Tennessee behind LSU at 11. You had Ole Miss at 16. You had South Carolina at 18. Oklahoma at 17. Missouri at 20. Schools that are ranked behind Auburn in recruiting right now, but are currently getting better on the field results. I think you see those results flip in 2025 here, where, quite honestly, I'm not sure Missouri is going to have a better season on the field than Auburn with the talent that these two schools have, especially with Brady Cook and Luther Burden going out from Missouri. Ole Miss loses Jackson Dart. Lane Kiffin has a great track record with quarterbacks, but at some point you're going to hit a wall where he's not going to get a Jackson Dart type. And could Jackson Arnold be that next Jackson Dart or that next Brady Cook? That's what I think we start to see this year. But this has got to be the year where Auburn moves ahead of at least the schools, I think.
In terms of results, yes. And I think in order to one of the things that I think I've been impressed with this coaching staff is considering where the floor has been for Auburn, getting these kids to buy in to the future, right? That's one of the things you expect for your head coach to be able to do, is to sell and forecast a bright future for Auburn and to invite these kids to be the foundational pieces for a growing program, right? However, if you want to sustain that success recruiting and being in the conversation with some of these blue chip recruits, you're going to have to show and prove on the field, or show proof of concept in terms of where this program is heading. Doesn't necessarily mean you have to be in the playoff conversation, although that does help. You do need to show end over end, year over year improvement on the football field. And for Auburn to have not shown that through the first 2 seasons on the football field, it puts a lot of pressure on year 3 in the Hugh Freeze era, because now a lot more of this team resembles a lot of the kids you brought in. So gone are the excuses or the days of you saying, hey, I need time to get my kids in here, my guys in here, to be able to execute what we want to do. You got Jackson Arnold, as you just mentioned. You've got guys at receiver. You've met needs along the offensive line. Now is the time to really begin to show this is the vision that I was talking about a year or 2 ago. And if you're able to show that, you're able to continue to have some of the wins and victories in recruiting to continue to build that talent and to continue to close the gap with teams that you're closing in on. You have a blue chip ratio, Mike, that's released every summer. They haven't released the one for 2025 just yet, but there's 2024, and Auburn is right outside the top 15 at 16 at 53%. You have like 7 or 8 ACC programs ahead of them. And that's almost kind of consistent with what you have seen or just reported in terms of the recruiting results year after year. You have about 7 or 8 teams in the top 15 every season. And so Auburn is beginning to put themselves in that conversation from a talent standpoint. But in order to continue to recruit on the level of the teams that you're trying to close the gap with, you're going to have to begin to show results that show that you're heading in the right direction, that you know what to do with the talent. These kids want to go to places where they want to win. They've been winners all of their lives playing football. They don't want to go to a school where they're going to start losing games and not be able to experience what it's like to contend for a conference title, to contend for a playoff spot, to contend for an upper tier bowl game. You're going to have to begin to show that Auburn is a place where you can continue your success as a highly recruited football player.
Yeah, look, success matters at the end of the day. Recruiting is great, but what you do with the talent is what is going to matter at the end of the day if you're Hugh Freeze. We have said this again and again. We'll continue to say it as the season gets closer. This is a prove-it year for Hugh Freeze in year 3. They've asked for patience. I think they've gotten it, but there's still certain pressures that come along with being at a program like Auburn because of the money that's being invested. You can't get that kind of investment without some sort of expectation. That expectation is going to come with pressure. But look, how well is Auburn doing versus the schools that we just mentioned? We'll talk about that right after a quick word from our sponsors. This episode of the Auburn Express is brought to you by our friends at the Vibe Vault. You can find them at 3462 Crosswinds Road, Suite E in Phoenix City, Alabama. That's right across the street from the Chattahoochee Valley Community College, next to Renfro's Supermarket and Marco's Pizza. The Vibe Vault. If you're in the Columbus, Phoenix City area and you're looking to get fresh for the weekend, get fresh for the weekend with the Vibe Vault. Not just barbers, lifestyle consultants. This episode of the Auburn Express, powered by the War Report, is brought to you by our friends at the Rogue Shop. Visit rogueshop.com. Use code REPORT to get 15% off that Rogue Shop order. Pain, sleep, stress, anxiety, whatever ails you in life, the Rogue Shop has something that has you covered. Longtime sponsors of the show. Please go check them out. Make sure you let them know the War Report sent you by using that code REPORT. Also, our friends at Golden's Cast Iron. Visit goldenscastiron.com/WR. Use code Get Your Weight Up for 15% off your weights and code TWR for $65 off fire pits and Kamado grills. Golden's Cast Iron, workout, grill out, chill out with Golden's Cast Iron. Caesar, let's jump back into the conversation here. Again, I mentioned the LSUs. I mentioned the Texas A&Ms. We just did a live show yesterday where we talked about the money, right? The House settlement just passed. Money is about to be poured into these programs in ridiculous amounts. Schools have been preparing for this. If you're Auburn, I think that the results need to start to match the investment. Now, that number by Vegas has been set at 7.5. Under 7.5, you got some tough questions to answer. Over 7.5, I think you can prove that the program is moving forward. But this version of the schedule that they have this year, you don't have some of those teams on your schedule. Like, you get to dodge Ole Miss and LSU in terms of moving your program forward, but not having to play those schools and proving that you're moving it forward, at least for next season.
Yeah. Again, I think one of the things that when you talk about the new ruling, it doesn't affect some of the schools that have money, right? So A&M's not affected by this. LSU's not affected by this. Auburn's not impacted by this. So really and truly, what this boils down to me, Mike, is your ability as a program to be able to evaluate talent as it pertains to the needs that you have on your roster. A couple of years ago, Auburn brought in Will Redmond from LSU, and he was a guy who did a good job of bringing in talent to LSU. One of the guys of which turned out to be a Heisman winning QB at LSU. So Auburn's ability to be able to address needs on the offensive side of the ball, the defensive side of the ball, to bring in some of those guys who may not have been one of the highly recruited guys, but someone whose skill set fits what they want to do, what Hugh Freeze and staff wants to do, and be able to go out and not only have the weapons on your roster, but to be able to coach those guys up and develop them to be able to execute the game plan that you want to execute on Saturdays. It's now becoming an issue of, okay, how good can these coaches really put together what they've assembled, Mike? And to me, that's what's going to help continue to close that gap between you and the other coaching staff. Because again, you want kids to know that they're going to Auburn. They're buying into Auburn because they believe this is the best place for them to not only compete for championships, but to also to develop into the player that's going to help them get to the next level. Because again, that's a selling point that we saw Alabama under Nick Saban sell to these blue chips all the time, is that, yeah, I'm going to a winner, but I'm also seeing this wall of professional athletes that y'all putting in the league year after year. And that's another conversation that we had recently when we talked about the NFL draft, is that Auburn has to begin to show that, hey, not only can you compete for championships here and win a lot of games, ton of games, but we can also be the stepping stone to get you into the league as a high draft pick, making a lot of money and playing at the highest level. Again, one of the most effective things that Hugh Freeze did as soon as he got here from a recruiting standpoint is that he put those wide receivers on the phone with some of the guys in the NFL today, and the impact that had. You gotta continue to keep that pipeline going. Everyone can't continue to talk to DJ Metcalf year after year. We got to start talking to a Cam Coleman. You got to start talking to some of these other guys that you've brought into this program that has helped win games for Auburn to propel it forward. So again, it starts with the talent that you've assembled now and be able to win some of these games. Auburn faces off against A&M this year. Auburn's going to have to show something. They won last year, but now you have to go on the road and win. You're going to have to beat the Oklahomas. You're going to have to beat some of these teams that are in that same tier that you've worked your way into to show that, hey, this isn't a fluke. Auburn is actually heading in the right direction.
Well, yeah. Not only have you beat those teams in that same tier, but you got to make sure you continue to beat the teams that are not in the same tier. Vanderbilt is not in the same tier as Auburn. You lost to them last year. Kentucky is not in the same tier as Auburn. They beat them by 2 touchdowns last season. Jarquez Hunter ran for over 270 yards in that game. You got to keep that going. I'm going to pull the schedule up here, and I'll say it out loud for our listeners on pod. Something that we've pulled up often, but you've got
to beat Arkansas.
Yeah, right. You got Baylor to kick your season off. You got Ball State, South Alabama, and then you open up with a revenge game for Jackson Arnold versus Oklahoma. That's your SEC opener, September the 20th. You got A&M on the road. You come home for Georgia. You're home for Missouri, and then you've got Arkansas on the road. They are not in that same tier as Auburn, but you lost to them last year. You got to beat them. Kentucky, I mentioned, not in that same tier as Auburn. Vanderbilt, Mercer, obviously not an SEC team. And then you've got Alabama, who has come back a lot closer to the back than they were 2 years ago in Saban's last year. Now going into Kalen DeBoer's second year in Tuscaloosa. You got to prove that you're moving closer to him as well, I think. But look, if you're Auburn, this is the schedule that you needed to get this done. You needed to get show that movement in year 3, and it's going to come down to taking the guys that you have, taking the Cam Colemans, making them stars, making these guys all SEC names. So look, I think going into 2026, Auburn has a couple of potential Heisman level talents on this team. Cam Coleman, if you can get him the ball enough, he's a guy who should be in the conversation for a Heisman. Right? If Devontae Smith can bring home a wide receiver for Alabama with decent quarterback play, we should see Cam Coleman in that conversation. Right? Yeah. They're talking about Eric Singleton having 4.2 speed and possibly playing himself into the first round of the NFL draft this coming season. You've got Perry Thompson, top 30 overall player. I think he was 28 coming out of high school, who should become a star this season. You've got to start to produce stars and dubs at the same time. And you've got the talent, I think, on par with A&M and LSU, but definitely better than Arkansas, Kentucky, and Vanderbilt.
I agree. And I think that's been one of the most frustrating parts of watching Auburn through the first 2 years is that, yes, you definitely can point to some of the teams on Auburn's schedule that they've lost to that they were more talented than. You can't tell me that Cal was more talented than Auburn last year. You can't tell me that Arkansas was more talented than Auburn last year. Vanderbilt was not more talented than Auburn last year. So being able to beat the teams that you're supposed to while also contending with and beating teams that are in your same tier. But also as well, Mike, you're going to have to, if you're really showing that Auburn is truly on the rise, you're going to have to compete with and beat some of the teams that are not in your same tier that are in a higher tier. And Auburn has had their opportunities to beat in Alabama and Jordan-Hare the last 2 trips that Alabama has come to Jordan-Hare. Auburn has had a chance to compete with and almost beat Georgia when they've come to Jordan-Hare the last time. So you're going to have to take advantage of those opportunities when you find yourself in close games with some of these teams that you're trying to catch. You're going to have to capitalize as well. And again, Auburn has the talent now to be able to do that. I don't think there's any excuses this year moving forward, Mike, because all of the things that Auburn pointed to or Hugh Freeze pointed to in the past, those things are no longer the case. You got a wide receiver. You got 2 QBs now on your roster, at least, that you can point to be able to run your offense. The excuse days are over. It's now time to show and prove.
There is one more team that is not on Auburn's schedule, but I think you need to prove that you're in a tier above, and that's Ole Miss. Look, you know how I feel about Ole Miss. But this is a school that has perennially underachieved. They should have been a lock as a playoff participant last year. They blew it. And I think you see the time run out for Lane Kiffin in terms of actually getting it done because, as I've mentioned before, if you're not moving forward, you might as well be moving backwards because everybody else is making strides forward. Everyone else is trying to get better. So if you're standing still, you're getting passed by in this league. And Ole Miss feels like one of those teams that's somewhat standing still. They've been pretty good in terms of development, but their high school recruiting is lazy. And eventually, I think that catches up to them. And if you're Auburn, you cannot continue to lag behind Ole Miss in terms of results on the field. If you're Hugh Freeze, you need to raise that talent floor to a point where there's no conversation about who's better at getting the most out of their respective teams because Auburn has so much more potential on the top end and a higher ceiling when it comes to talent than Ole Miss. You are a better program. You're a better city. You have a better fan base. You've got money. I just don't see how Auburn continues to lag behind a school like Ole Miss, and you can tell everybody that you're moving the right direction.
Well, listen, I know we like to take a dump on Ole Miss. It's an easy thing to do, but one of the best things that could have happened for Auburn is that Ole Miss missed the playoffs, right?
Yeah.
Because now, as you said, if you're not moving forward, you're potentially moving backwards. And now what that means is that, again, if Auburn is actually acquiring the talent, remember, Auburn has beat Ole Miss in a few key battles for some of the key talents coming out of high school. And so that's going to catch up in a few years. Once you get these kids on campus, get them developed, they start contributing. That's going to become a problem for Ole Miss. And to me, they had an amazing window last year to get to the college football playoff. They had an inexplicable loss at home to Kentucky. And when you have losses like that, again, you have to show that you're ascending by beating teams you're supposed to beat. If Auburn begins to do that, you're going to easily catch a program like Ole Miss in this year. Unless Ole Miss goes on an amazing run this year and make it to the college football playoff, you will, for the most part, have caught them because Ole Miss has not, they haven't ascended to that next tier of programs who are competing for championships, Mike. And that's where Auburn wants to go. And you think about programs like Missouri. Missouri was right there as well. They had an opportunity to get to 10 wins and get to the college football playoff. Auburn plays Missouri this year. So Auburn has an amazing opportunity this year to really pass some of those programs that have passed Auburn over the past few seasons because of its ineptness on the field.
Yeah, I agree. Look, great conversation that we have ongoing about Auburn and the talent and where they're at. Hopefully it pays dividends in terms of wins and losses in 2025. We'll continue to track that. I want to thank my guy, C-Dub, for joining me on today's show. Guys, if you're in the comments after the video, do us a favor, smash that super thanks button. Show us some love. Help keep the work that we're doing here going at the War Report. That's it for another great edition of the Auburn Express. If you want more content like this, please hit like and subscribe. We are the War Report on every social media platform. TW Report on TikTok. We're signing off, and as always, War Eagle.